what we're going to do in this next little bit is go through a summary of today. We'll ask if there's questions of FDA, and then we'll do a little wrap-up that'll get us ready for tomorrow. In terms of how today was broken out, when Gretchen introduced it this morning, she talked about this being in 4 stages. We're at the end of day 1. We have successfully completed 2 stages, so that's good. The 2 stages that we've completed are the first stage, which is identifying risks, and things that I heard, and I'm interested if you all agree. Testing, what is a representative sample? Where do I take that representative sample? The words before harvest are not obvious for a lot of crops. What exactly does that mean? If it's a multiple harvest crop, if you've got multiple crops on your farm and some harvest before others, that was a reoccurring theme I heard. MWQP development on sources you don't use every year. What's the impact of water quality from 4 years ago? That came up in this particular group, so there's still a lot of questions about that. One of the things that ran between the 2 is sharing of information. And you guys addressed this a little bit in that sharing is allowed, but we're not exactly sure what that looks like yet. I think the other thing that goes with sharing is communication. And a lot of government, regional, local, there's a lot of people doing water sampling, but it doesn't seem clear how to tap into all of that information and what part of that information would be valuable. How would we do it? So when I think about opportunity, that's an opportunity to sort of try and begin to tackle where all that data is and how do we gain access to it. And then there were concerns about die-off, and that came up, I think, in both groups. The concern that die-off isn't something you should depend on, or the concern that if you let us have die-off, I think this was Michelle who said it, and from blossom to fruit development is months, why can't we use it there? And I want to give you an opportunity because I think you guys wanted to mention something else about this. So I think this would be a good place to.
So I just wanted to provide a little bit of clarification on the language around the blossom. So the language around the blossom is actually not very prescriptive within the preamble for the produce safety rules. So we are very open to hearing your thoughts about when the water requirements would be applicable to the harvestable portion. So it's, again, it's one of those sort of fluid things that would be commodity dependent and it could be operation dependent. And so we'd definitely love to hear feedback on how that would impact your operation.
So the answer is fill them up with information. They're willing to take more information. So that sort of was sort of some of my thinking of summary coming out of the first section. And then we moved on to Jeff's presentation on assessing risks. And one thing that seemed to occur in most of the breakout groups was, and I thought this was very interesting because until today I hadn't really thought about it this way, but a lot of the groups seemed to come out with, well, there's baseline issues that might be there. And the feeling is that your normal testing will pick up if there's a baseline problem. If there's some contamination that's rolling in on a regular basis, you'll catch it. Then there was this notion of reoccurring events. And I think reoccurring events got defined a couple of different ways. There were some reoccurring events that seemed to be seasonal. There were some reoccurring events that seemed to be environmental or local. Things happen locally in farms, and so that was, I think, couched under a reoccurring event. Let me be clear, you guys all called it something else. I'm calling it reoccurring event and then trying to tell you how you guys seem to describe it. And people seem to think, I certainly think from the farmer's perspective, they feel like they have a handle on some of that stuff, like they know what generally happens. Then there was this third category, which I'm going to call unusual events. Okay, things that you didn't see coming. Maybe hurricanes people see coming, but things that I think were under here were things like flooding, your neighbor cleaning out his chicken coop, hurricanes, I didn't write down the whole list of what you guys put, but there were multiple rare or unanticipated events. And the question came up, our normal testing isn't even, what do we do at that point? In our group, one of the questions was a snow melt, and another group brought this up. It was a woman. I don't remember who it was, but I know it was a female. Was it you, Kate? Okay, it was you. This issue of a snow melt, and then that happens, and what do we do about that? What is that supposed to do for us? And what kind of information is available to help us? The other thing that came up with unusual events, and this came up in at least 2 groups, maybe microbial testing at that point isn't enough. Maybe we're now concerned about chemical risks aside from microbial risks. And that, I know, came up in our group as well. I really do want to go back to this idea that growers felt like they could understand risks on their own farm, that they should be responsible for looking at animal presence, movement, domesticated animals. I think the other thing that came up in a couple of groups, though, was education and training. If you don't know that you're supposed to be looking for those risks, how do you identify them? And looking at hazards versus risks. And again, I think Jeff did a good job of trying to show this, but how do we look at hazards that we know are out there versus when it turns into a risk to the crop? One of the other things that got said a lot was flexibility. We need the flexibility. So, and I think it was Donalyn Brown who was talking about that being a double-edged sword. She didn't say it that way, but she said, we want guidance, but not too much, I think was the exact phrase she used. So how do we get information that's helpful without tying our hands? And I think that was a sentiment that was shared. In terms of solutions, and if you look around these sheets in the back, you will see this time and time again, sanitary surveys. How do we use information besides testing to effectively understand hazards? And I think that's one that's a huge opportunity because I don't think there's a lot of information out there for us right now. And I think this is something that very well may come down to be commodity specific or regionally specific. Given all of the groups, I kind of wonder now if we didn't do a disservice by mixing up all the regions. Maybe we should have broken you out into disciplines by region. That just occurred to me now, so sorry about that. But looking at how you guys were laying this out, maybe that's something to think about if we do another meeting moving forward. And my entire group just cringed right there. Did you see that? The collective shudder of every PSA team member in the room. I think the other thing is it's still not clear how much testing we need to be doing. I don't think there's a single person in this room who is comfortable with 20 samples, 15 samples. I think if we had a melee, I don't think we'd have somebody climb out on top on that one. I just feel like that came up in every group. And again, I have, with exclamation points at the bottom of my paper, there's a huge communication issue between a lot of groups. And I think there's a lot of information out there that I don't think we're tapping into, or we feel like we don't know how to tap into. I can't decide which it is, but that came up in a lot of the discussions. So that's sort of my summary. I know that's just my summary, but is there anything else that you guys think is like a big theme that we missed? Or now is your chance with FDA here to sort of ask a few more questions about anything. Now, I have to tell you, we had extra time this morning, so some of the stuff we did this morning we actually already did, and so we're ahead of schedule. But yeah, do you guys have any questions, clarifications, anything you want to add to that summary? Yeah, you can.
Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of react to some of the things that you were talking about. There was a discussion about the double-edged sword of being too specific, not being flexible enough, the power of being flexible, and I guess the other side of being too specific to certain situations. The rule itself, again, think about the house that I talked about this morning. The rule itself is very general. And in the absence of guidance, as long as you're kind of, you're doing, you're following the requirements of the rule, and you can argue that it falls within that framework without additional guidance, that's what you would be responsible for at this point. Now, guidance is guidance. Let me clarify that. Guidance is guidance. Guidance is non-binding. And in my scenario that I talked about, the furniture can be shifted around all over the place. It's non-binding. And so the guidance would only provide recommendations. It would provide some further context as to, how a grower could comply with the requirements under a certain scenario. Some of the scenarios that we heard through our breakout discussions and what was shared today, I think are very valuable. That's very valuable information to us, and those are things that could be addressed in guidance. And again, using that example, the house example, I mean, how many people in here, when they first bought a home, they had a couch, a TV, and a bed? Maybe I'm the only one, but the point is that with time you add on top of it. You add furniture on top of it, and you fill out the space and you make it more comfortable. And so with time, with information, with situations, we add on to the guidance. We add more scenarios that will address some of the situations that we've heard today and other situations that we'll run into. I just wanted to share that.
We should have brought those we have little pump guns in our.
All right, thank you. This is a very specific question, and I don't really necessarily expect an answer, but just to again, share with you, put out things that people are trying to understand. So let's just pretend that this came out in our breakout session, more or less. All right. As it relates to allowable and available corrective measures, if covered crop treatment with hyperchlorinated reclaimed wastewater is allowed, why wouldn't responsible use of chlorine, at least as a short-term corrective measure, also be recognized and allowed?
I mean, I think it is allowed. I don't know if you could expand a little more on that and what makes you think that that's not an option under the current framework, or
maybe, yeah. It goes back to my understanding, in practical terms, in terms of available chemistries to treat pre-harvest water. That's really, where the question comes from. It's devices that are recognized, hyperfiltration that's recognized, but even though it's a long-standing practice for many growers to use, particularly calcium hypochlorite, some are using some other chemistries, this specific label language does not allow them to use those remedies. But you can use reclaimed wastewater, which is hyperchlorinated and tested, which would be compliant.
Yeah, I mean, I think this kind of goes back to what we had mentioned earlier in the day, just about how, depending on the use of the water and I guess the status of the produce, it affects whether FDA or EPA regulates those antimicrobial chemicals. So in this case, these would be EPA-regulated products. And so if it's allowed on the EPA label, then yeah, that would be an option. Is there anything to add?
Yeah, Trevor, I was just going to add that on there too, is that that's something that comes up with growers that I work with all the time, is that if it's allowed in some other practice to come in contact with the commodity, why can't we do it for compliance with ag water? And consistently, the problem has been that because when it's in a production environment, it's the EPA that has control over that stuff that's being applied out in the production environment. What I have told growers is that if you're using some kind of chemical that according to the label is used for something, for instance, using copper in a pond to reduce snails or algae or something like that, and you're applying it for that legally listed reason, you're applying it for the reduction of algae, but you have the added benefit of it also reduces bacteria, then it's a win-win for you. You don't have to say, I'm doing it in order to reduce my microbial contamination of my pond. It just happens to be that it's going to be that much easier for you to comply with your water quality, because as you're reducing algae, you're also reducing bacteria.
That's the one thing that we have to be careful of as a regulatory agency in addressing this and the rule, and really, yeah, I mean, even sharing it here in this forum is that that we can't really, provide any advice that conflicts with, EPA regulations, and so, if you use, we would ask, and everything in our rule basically is framed in view of the policies that exist not only with FDA but also with EPA. And so I guess to answer your question, we would rely on EPA to approve those methods or those treatments in order for us to actually explicitly recognize them ourselves. Does that answer your question, or you're looking confused? Okay.
I'm going to try and restate the question. I think the point is that for these treatments, the chemicals they're using are not labeled for the treatment, but they're getting the effect if they're possibly using it for a labeled purpose, which is not this express purpose. It's a different purpose, but they're getting this effect. Now, what Trevor described is they would need to use it for that specific thing, and that's where the rub is. Yes. Correct? Okay. Yeah. Oh, we've got hands shooting up for you remote people. We're just waiting for the microphone to get passed.
So I get that, but I want to complicate what Trevor says. What if I am using it to treat algae, to prevent algae buildup, and then I test my water after I run the treatment? Is that a reasonable solution?
I test the water is used.
Yeah.
Cool.
I'm not going to say yes. That's,
So there was no. Can somebody say yes and not just nod?
If it's used in a way that aligns with what's on the label, then that would be fine.
Thank you.
Okay.
I have a question
Oh.
from the internet. So the question is specifically for Samir. And that question is, did you hear anything different today?
That's a loaded question. Let me look at my notes. No, I did hear a few things that struck me. There was a lot of discussion, actually, more than I originally thought there would be, about how sanitary surveys could inform a testing strategy. And I found, is this working? Okay. I found that very interesting, and I've kind of heard in conversations outside the room that, of various more specific approaches as to how that could be done. And so I would say that, is it different? I've heard, we've talked about that internally, but to hear it to the extent that we've heard it today so far, I think that's very, it hasn't come up on a regular basis in our previous engagements. Let's put it that way. Not to this extent. Is there anything that you can think of that, no?
No, I don't just want a dedicated mic. Thanks, but no. So this is a question that came out of one of our remote sites, and it is particularly around if a grower is already using the 4-day post-application of water interval, and then they're running it through a packing house process that they've validated for a set log reduction, and in this case, the example is citrus, where from the juice HACCP rule, they have processes that give them a certain kill step. Is there any way with those two things in place, they would ever get around testing requirements, and knowing that they've got the 4-day built-in window and the kill step in place in the packing house, that they would not have to test?
So I don't think that they would be able to get around the testing requirement. Those, both the die-off at the end of the last irrigation and the removal interval will both provide quite a bit of log reduction, but I don't think that you could ever get away with saying, no, I'm just not going to test. If you don't know what you're starting with your water, how do you know that each of those mitigation strategies is effective?
So I just got a text message that we dropped off when I asked my question and lost your answer. Okay. So for those remotely, my question related to if you are waiting the 4 days anyway and you have some sort of a validated treatment in your packing house, specifically in this case, the example was fresh citrus where they've got the log reduction from juice HACCP. Is there any way they would not have to test? And the answer was?
The answer was no. If you don't know what your starting point is, then there's no way that you can confirm that the mitigation strategies that you're applying are in fact effective. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything.
Okay, and then we also, I thought I heard it today, but somebody has asked you just to confirm that you would allow historic data to be used in water quality profiles.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we have it in the preamble saying that that's not an issue.
Perfect, thank you.
Did you want to add to that?
From the corner, from a farmer's point of view, how is the risk analysis different from a sanitary survey? What is going to be the difference in function and action for a sanitary survey compared with risk analysis?
Yeah. Yes,
So-
please.
Let me go back and get clarification, and then we'll follow up.
Any other questions? Okay. Then, which we'll give them a minute. Yep.
It's more of a comment.
Okay.
I'll just say that. So I guess the remote sites dropped when Samir was making the house analogy this morning, and they are eager to hear it again, or hear it for the first time. So maybe you could use some new examples of furniture or something to spice it up, but I know that they said they were on the edge of their seat, and then it froze, and they were like, oh my gosh, the analogy. Because you just referenced it, and they didn't know what you were talking about. So.
All right. I don't know how I can spice it up. It's already so spicy. All right. So, and this was, again, in context of the regulatory framework. I was offering an analogy that could help you visualize, and by relating the regulatory framework to building a house or a home, I would say, because we're also including furniture here, and just like in a house, when you're constructing a house, you lay down a foundation, and in kind of relating it to the regulatory framework. The statute, FISMA, the Food Safety Modernization Act, is the foundation. And in developing a house or constructing a house, you develop a wood frame or cinder block frame and a roof and windows and so forth. And in our analogy, the produce rule would kind of serve that function, that structure and function. And after you're done developing this house, you're finished constructing, it's an empty house, and it's not very comfortable. And so, in order to kind of, make it more comfortable, relatable, homey, you need some furniture in that house. And that's where the furniture is really the guidance, which you can add, change, shift around with time. And again, guidance is non-binding, and so again, you can shift things around easily. And at this stage of the process, what we're doing is we're taking a step back. We're looking at the house. We're assessing, do we need to change anything with the house itself? And looking through the house, is there furniture that we need to move around? And we're relying on you to help us figure that out together. So.
Samir, I'm very sorry to say that we cut out again.
No way.
But we won't make you tell it again. We'll make it a children's book, and it'll be a bestseller. They caught the end of it, but unfortunately, it just was not meant to be.
All right.
But we all appreciated hearing it a second time.
Yeah, I'm sure you did.
That in guidance, would that be okay? Yeah. So I'm going to take a little bit of liberty. The risk analysis starts with detecting and finding your hazards, and a sanitary survey involves looking for your hazards. So I think the main part of the question is, can those be used in conjunction for things like same level of public health protection, and that the sanitary survey builds into a risk analysis which can be useful in meeting the requirements of the rule?
Yeah, I mean, I think that all of those could combined be useful information to help you identify what same level of public health protection could look like. We identified those 4 factors earlier this morning, where we were talking about, what are the types of things that you would look for. And I think that identifying risks and understanding how those risks impact your operation definitely would play a part in identifying same level of public health protection.
And I know we have a bunch of risk assessors in this room right now. So the breakout session tomorrow, I think, would be a really good idea to bring up some of these ideas and, maybe different ways that we can manage water quality that doesn't necessarily rely as much on sampling, but more of a kind of like a combined sanitary survey sampling approach.
Okay, so we are now coming to the let's wrap it up. You guys can sit down, and we're going to wrap it up and get to the end of the day. So before we finish, I always like to do the end of the day brain dump. You guys have worked really hard today. Everybody's really tired. What I like to do at this point is, if there is something we did not talk about today that you want to make sure we talk about or that gets put on the docket for tomorrow, that is what goes up here. And the reason I do this is so that at night when you sleep soundly. And that you're not thinking, don't forget to bring this up. So if there's anything that anybody wants me to put on this, this is your opportunity, and we can write it up here. Anything we didn't talk about that we need to talk about, anything that sort of got skipped over in a cursory fashion that you think we need to go deeper on, now is the time to bring that up. I will also tell you that I will leave this here, and if you don't want to raise your hand publicly, you're allowed to come up and throw it on here at night. Chana, you have something? And she's a presenter, so this ought to be good.
I don't know about that. So we've danced around it a lot today, but we've yet to define what an acceptable risk for produce is.
Okay.
We look at the, drinking water, and we are looking at recreational water and risks associated with those. But we haven't done the risk assessment to produce to say what's acceptable and worked our way backwards to define a value.
So it's not just for produce, but produce for that level of public health protection, right?
Right.
Are you done writing, Bessie?
Sure. Go,
Okay.
Sharon.
We've talked about a lot of things. Is there going to be a time when we can articulate some of the areas, the key areas that we identify that need more research?
Yep, that's tomorrow.
Okay.
But I'm happy to write them up here if you think you have one in your head right now.
I mentioned it in the first group. We've talked a lot of people talked about die-off. There's 2 CPS studies that have shown that what FDA has is not long enough.
Okay. Thanks. Anybody want to add to that?
Chuck wants to add.
Okay.
Die off of what? Bacteria die off very rapidly compared to viruses. Viruses can persist for hepatitis A for 2 weeks on a cantaloupe, we found. So it depends what you mean by die off of an indicator or a virus or a protozoa.
Okay.
My question is different, and it relates to the eventual training and enforcement of on-site investigations. And will growers be notified when they have been given, when the enforcement mechanism has been enforced after they've done the educational on-site training? When do people, and I know we've talked about deadlines, but I know there's probably ongoing training and communication with states on you're training up your enforcement officers, identifying those enforcement officers, and I feel like the growers aren't getting notified that those people are being concurrently trained and will eventually be out investigating. So when will they be trained and when will people be notified? And
So an enforcement timeline?
yeah,
Is that a way to?
an enforcement timeline, because even though the deadline has been possibly extended, if it's not extended, then enforcement officers, they're going to get their charging orders. And so when will, I mean, more communication related to that.
Okay.
I'll let Betsy finish writing there.
Okay, go.
So there was something mentioned earlier today, a little bit about end consumer education. And that's something that we in our research group talk about a lot and through outreach, and we talk to growers about as well, is when do we get to the point where consumer responsibility takes over? That there's been great education campaigns that have gone out there for a number of different consumer products. You know, people know there's little asterisks on your menu that says eating raw or undercooked, you know, poultry or seafood or something like that, that you assume the risk for doing something like that. But when are we going to talk about educating the public that produce is not grown in a sterile environment and that it might be incumbent upon them to wash their produce prior to consuming it?
Okay, so here's what I put for that. When is consumer responsibility going to kick in? Consumer education, is that fair? I mean, I think, well, I won't tell you my opinion.
Our remote sites.
Remote sites?
Yep.
Okay.
So this one comes from Maryland, and I know this was brought up earlier, but what does data sharing for water testing actually look like? And then the second part to that is, where does the farmer responsibility end?
I think that's two different things, right?
And then there was a third one.
Hang on.
Okay.
I don't write that fast.
Sorry.
Okay, the second one was,
Where does farmer responsibility end?
okay. Okay.
And then this one says, discuss how to specifically make the rule less complex so that growers can comply with it.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay,
'cause
go.
I can't keep my mouth shut today, apparently. The texted in comment right now is to add a fundamental research project related to ag water and risks rather than using only the EPA rec water data.
Hang on. Was this a research one?
This is, oh,
Did somebody have another research one to add? No. Go ahead, Donna.
okay. This is a write-in question. So this kind of deals, I believe, with variability in criteria based on commodities. So are onions and carrots going to be looked at differently using ag water with drip irrigation? So I would summarize that as addressing variability in the criteria based on how risky a commodity is.
But I think that's already answered in the rule, right? FDA, were you listening to that? I want confirmation. Yeah. Repeat the question, Donna, because this is, I think, already covered in the rule.
Okay, so the specific question is, are onions and carrots going to be looked at differently using egg water with drip irrigation? So then I summarized it as variability in the criteria based on commodities.
But I think still it comes down to the definition of ag water and covered crops, would be my take on that.
Can I add, because I know some of the background to that question?
Sure.
The question is, could those be considered for other criteria because they are inherently a lower risk crop compared to, for instance, spinach and lettuce?
So we're comparing root crops to service crops.
That's right.
And so this is assuming that this is all ag water, correct?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, under the current rule requirements, no, I guess, unless there was some type of alternative or variance that would account for that. But that's another aspect that, moving forward, we might be able to account for that in some way, just based on those different growing characteristics.
Thanks. Cutting in front.
Said, some of the people I've talked with in that over the last year or so, the rule seems to be like a one-size-fits-all when you actually read through it, even though there's some clauses in there that says, like onions and carrots, it's a lower risk crop and an upper risk crop. Thinking outside the box and bringing our commodity groups into this that haven't really yet stepped forward to really set any standards for their commodity. What about thinking that if this is more of a default type of level of standard for those commodities that haven't actually put something together? Oftentimes, a commodity might assess themselves and say, we've got to be stricter, and they're not going to change if they've already got a stricter standard in. But other commodities say, you know what, our risk is so low that this is just overkill, and that our belief, and if we set this a standard, this is what it should fall as the standard for our commodity. And then if somebody doesn't have a commodity standard out there, the produce safety rules standard for water then becomes a default. When in doubt, go to the default. But at least this would get some of our commodities to step forward and say, you know what, our risk is higher, we feel we need to be higher, our risk is lower, this is way too much overkill, and let industry help put forth some of the standards to help put this to bed once and for all, and then we can move forward.
Well, I don't want to speak for FDA, but I think based on the flexibility of the rule that they continually outline, if those alternatives are based in science by commodity, then it seems to me that would be reasonable, but I want FDA to say that because I'm not FDA.
Absolutely. I can never tell if this thing's on. Yeah, no, absolutely. And we've heard about the argument about that the rule takes a one-size-fits-all approach. And I get that because we explicitly lay out testing, sampling requirements around generic E. coli and so forth. But at the same time, we do allow for these alternatives and variances, and that is kind of an invitation for commodity groups based on local conditions. If you're looking for variances, alternatives, it's much more flexible. And so, yeah, I mean, that's something that we would encourage be done. And we can see it, as you describe it, work both ways. In some cases, there may be less stringent requirements that are necessary, and in other cases, maybe the commodity group would be compelled to apply more stringent requirements.
Okay.
Mine's very simple.
Yeah.
Sorry, along the lines of the water districts and the universities and the things that work with us and help us test our water, and we have a lot of research and a lot of help from them. I'd like to see a focus on, getting those people funded better and getting those things, a more of a reality, so that when I'm in a PSA training course, I don't have 15 farmers yelling and screaming at me that they can't afford to do testing, and why does everything trickle down to them? And, it goes on and on and on. And I feel like saying, well, there's lots of help out there. We just got to realize how to utilize it, right?
More funding for research?
Yeah, right.
The comment was more funding for research.
Yeah, I've been asked by the number of Amish growers we have in my state, if there's any method or is there any way forward for our wells and our springs, if there's any way to enclose or cap those water sources so they'd no longer be considered surface water, because that would definitely be less of a burden for our Amish growers.
For tomorrow, does this work? Yeah. I won't be here tomorrow, I'm sorry for that, but one thing that I think would be important, I'd like to reformulate the question, where does the farmer responsibility end, into what is the responsibility that the industry could and should take to particularly look at this more flexible approach of sanitary inspections. In the end, it's the industry who is responsible for placing a safe food product on the market, and we've been looking a lot at FDA now, how they can develop more effective regulations, but I think any regulation that can be enforced in some way necessarily has to be generic, and it's within that that playing field where, and it's been said, we need something like a clear mark in the sense this is acceptable and this is not acceptable in some way. And then it's up, I think, to the industry to explore how the very different situations can be effectively managed, how guidance can be provided to the growers, to anybody in the industry. So I think it should be also a balanced discussion about what is the responsibilities of FDA, what's the responsibilities of the industry themselves to fill in achieving a safe product, because in the end it'll only work if both parties are really working together and also know the responsibilities. And in that sense, I sometimes have a little bit of the feeling that we're looking a bit too much to FDA and say you arrange it and it should be fully effective.
So that, Ari, just to capture that balance of responsibility, industry, growers, FDA, that it has to be a balance between them? Okay. Yep, Connie.
All right, so seeing as this is kind of a moving target, right? Once you've been trained in ag water produce safety rule, how often should someone be retrained? Is this something that we might have continuing education units for?
On that one is when we did our focus groups, 8 of them across the country back in 2012 and 2013, we had asked that question a lot. Is this going to be a one and done, one and done, one and done? 112.22c looks a lot like one and done. Nobody accepts that as acceptable. So what we've been doing is creating additional educational modules, as you're aware of, supplemental modules. I know the regional centers have been doing that as well. I think one of the important things, and I think this came up at the meeting that was just in New Mexico, was how do you coordinate those efforts to make sure we're making the most out of the minimal funding we have. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything to that. I can just tell you it definitely came out in the focus groups time and time again without seeding that question. Anyone? Okay. Okay,
I don't know if we can answer this question here, but one of the things that has come up a lot is 6 hours to get to testing things done. And we can talk about all the methodologies all we want to, but in reality, we just can't get done in 6 hours in Texas. One of the things that we do have is the state has other sources, other labs that they test municipal water and make sure the cities are able to comply and keep the water safe for consumers. They've offered to do these all the tests that are part of it can be done at these labs. But the states don't have the funds to be able to train their folks to do these labs. We could have 3 labs in South Texas if funded by the state, if the state had the funds to be able to implement the labs. We can't use our CAP money to do that, so we need other ways to pay for that.
Okay. All right. Yep. All right.
Yeah, just a quick question, and I'm trying to think how to phrase this the best, but the term that keeps coming to mind is does the FDA anticipate any type of like whistleblower phenomena or something like that? Because many regions and many commodities are functioning under the same system, same procedures, and doing the same things. If way down the road we get to the point where it's prosecutionable for not following the FISMA rules, what would stop someone from revealing that others aren't? Because a lot of us are really privy to what other people in the industry are doing. So I don't know if you could shorten that up.
Well,
But
they're sitting right in front of you,
yeah,
so they can answer
I was going
that
to put him on the
question.
spot right now, but yeah, just.
You guys can answer that. Have you talked about whistleblower problems or anticipated that?
Actually, we have not really talked about whistleblower problems specifically. No. No, I can't say that we've really had any conversations about how to address a whistleblower situation.
Give that boy a piece of candy.
Yeah.
You heard something new. Yeah? Yeah?
Betsy,
Oh, yeah.
you have the internet working overtime,
Okay.
and one of the questions that come is, what would it take to have commodity-specific water guidelines?
Commodity-specific water guidelines. I ain't answering that tonight.
Am I up? Okay. Betsy, when you're ready.
Yep.
Kind of along those same lines, for FDA, what kind of guidances will be created and by when? We've heard
Please, give us the guidance rundown.
that.
And
Yeah,
when.
we've heard that phrase a lot today. And then our NASDA group assisted with that in 2016, related to going over a lot of irrigation water monitoring and sampling scenarios. So that was just, like
Yep, there's
14 months ago, we finished that effort.
Two questions. Anybody want to lobby up an answer? How many guidances and when?
Specifically,
Yeah,
right?
water guidance.
Yeah.
Sure.
So, I mean, at this point, given where we are right now in terms of kind of revisiting the standards, it, kind of held off on working on guidance for water. Got to figure out where we're going to land first before we develop guidance. So that's all I can really say about that. That it just would be premature for us to develop guidance around something that we don't know what it will look like yet. So.
Okay. Yep. Go ahead.
Oh, it's another question. It's a text-in question from Texas that I've been asked to read with a Texas accent, but I'm going to decline. Do you want to read it for me? Can economic assessments be made to see if the cost of testing water can be shared with someone else, such as clients or consumers, depending on the economic capacity of growers?
How about, can I just write this up? Is it economic assessment of sharing water sampling costs?
Yes. I think that's sufficient.
Y'all. Kristen's sitting too close to you. She really could have read that question for you. All right.
Am I up?
Okay. We got, where are we
Betsy,
at? Yep.
another one of those questions is alternatives are only allowed for certain restricted areas by FDA. Would FDA consider expanding areas in the rule that could use alternatives?
I don't think the alternatives are limited at all.
Yes,
They are, well, I mean, not limited at all, but alternatives, okay.
My assumption is that this is saying not exclusively to water.
You guys want to answer that? Go ahead. I'm a little perplexed on the question, so I'm just going to shut up.
I mean, we're only looking at water right now as far as water alternatives specific to water. That's maybe something we could expand upon, but the rule in general, I don't think that's something on the table right now.
Well, and maybe it means that because alternatives are around the sample frequency as well as the indicator organism, can it be expanded beyond those two areas? That's absolutely a possibility. It could be. Yeah. That's on the table. I think that's that sounds like what you were getting at.
Okay.
Yep.
So if there was a commodity group that was actually testing the produce, does that substitute for water testing? And is that something that might be an alternative?
I guess, I mean, if you could show that it's an equivalent level of public health protection, then yeah, I don't see why not.
Okay, I think we'll take one more.
Thank you.
And it's our colleague from Mexico.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay. Regarding to FISMA, we're supposed to monitor generic E. coli. Although there are importers that are requesting more stringent requirements, like for some of our customers, they are asking for 0 coliforms on the irrigation water. I know that is not fair, but as a grower, how can I defend, my food safety plans if I am okay with the FISMA?
I got nothing for you there. I'll write it on the board.
Just write it
there. Can we write it on the board? I'll write it on the board. Can I capture this under crazy buyer requirements? Could I just put it down as there? Or unachievable crazy buyer requirements? Okay. Okay, you're all getting chatty. Settle down. We're almost there. Okay. So let me run you through the end. Here's the end. Yes, Mark Twain. That's hilarious. Where's my quote that goes with that? All right. Things you need to know. This is important to quiet down. It's very, very important. There is a social on the 16th floor in the Mark Twain room, and I am absolutely sure there is a Mark Twain quote that would be quite appropriate. I just did not know it was in that room, so I didn't look one up. There are adult beverages, non-adult beverages, and I'm going to throw this out to Don Steckel, who says there are locally relevant adult beverages. Come on, Kentucky bourbon people. Okay. There is dinner on your own following the social. In your packet, on the left pocket of your folder, there is a Have Fun in Cincinnati guide to help guide you through what you might want to do while you're there on your own. We will begin tomorrow at 9 a.m. sharp, coffee at 8:30. Now, yes, and this is important. Surprise, all you remote sessions who have been having Zoom problems all day. Hopefully you can hear me loud and clear. We are all going to take a group picture. So if you could just stand up and come forward if you're willing to be in the picture, and all of our remote sites, we would absolutely love pictures sent to us of the remote sites. If you send them to me or Gretchen, we will even put together a slideshow to run before tomorrow morning's session so that we can see your pretty little mugs. Oh, good. Super. There's Elizabeth Newbold ahead of her game right there. And with that, please come forward and we'll take a group picture and I'll see you all at the reception. Oh, wait, one last thing, because I see this gentleman in the green shirt. Where's my microphone over here? He came late. He had plane problems. He didn't get to introduce himself. So we're going to make him introduce himself as the last thing before a picture.
Yeah, I apologize. I was flying on United, and their customer service did not listen as well as the FDA did today. So, but I'm James Nichols, family farming operation from Hanford, California. We grow, process and market pistachios and almonds.
All right, with that, please come forward. We'll get a picture, and thank you all for your attention today.